There's something about the gods that has always pulled at us, something primal, something irresistible. Across thousands of years and countless civilizations, their stories have survived, not as dusty relics of the past, but as living, breathing echoes of our deepest fears and desires. Think about it. Why do we still whisper the names of Zeus and Aphrodite, of Odin and Freyja, as if they might overhear us? Why do their tales of love and war, betrayal and sacrifice feel as urgent today as they did to the people who first carved them into stone? The answer lies in the raw, unfiltered humanity of these myths. They're not just stories, they're mirrors, and when we gaze into them, we don't just see the gods. We see ourselves. Today, we're stepping into that mirror. We're unraveling 25 of the most gripping, heart-wrenching, and awe-inspiring myths of divine love and war stories that have shaped empires, ignited rebellions, and even altered the course of history. These aren't just fables about distant deities. They're about the moments when the divine and mortal worlds collided, leaving scars and sparks that still smolder today. Picture this: a love so fierce it topples kingdoms, a wrath so consuming it drowns continents, a jealousy so sharp it splits the sky. These myths are the original epics, the blueprints of every grand romance and battlefield saga that followed. And yet, for all their grandeur, they're achingly human, because when the gods love, they love with our hearts. When they rage with our fists. So let's begin where all great stories do, on the edge of chaos, in the space between a whisper and a storm. Over the next 25 myths, you'll witness passion that defies death, vengeance that reshapes the heavens, and alliances forged in fire. You'll meet goddesses who wield love like a weapon and gods who wage war like poets. And by the end, you might just realize something startling: these aren't ancient tales at all. They're happening right now, in every heartbeat, every choice, every conflict that tears us apart, and every love that stitches us back together. This is where the divine and the human meet. Are you ready to cross that line? Even the gods couldn't resist a forbidden love. Picture this: Ares, the god of war, all fury and fire, his hands stained with the dust of battle. And then there's Aphrodite, born from sea foam, a tempest of desire in human form. Their passion was explosive, not just because of who they were, but because of what they represented. Love and war tangled together, defying the order of Olympus. This wasn't some whispered flirtation. Their affair burned so brightly it threatened to scorch the heavens. But here's where the myth twists. Hephaestus, Aphrodite's husband, the smith god, wasn't just a cuckolded figure of pity. He was a craftsman, a strategist. And when he discovered the betrayal, he didn't roar or rage, he plotted. Imagine the scene: a golden net, invisible as air, woven with such precision it could trap even the divine. He draped it over their bed, and the next time Ares and Aphrodite came together, the net snapped shut. Naked, exposed, tangled in their own lust, they became a spectacle for all Olympus to mock. The gods laughed, but there's something deeper here. This wasn't just about humiliation, it was about consequences. Even the gods couldn't escape them. Now dig a little deeper, and you'll find variations of this myth where the story darkens. In some versions, Hephaestus doesn't just trap them, he demands payment from the other gods to release them. In others, Ares and Aphrodite's love doesn't fade after the scandal. It grows fiercer, more defiant, because that's the thing about forbidden love: it doesn't wither under judgment. It roots deeper, louder, until it becomes its own kind of war, and that's the real magic of this myth. It's not just about gods behaving badly. It's about the way passion and conflict are two sides of the same blade, cutting through the illusions of order, exposing the raw, messy truth beneath. Love is never simple when gods are involved, especially for Psyche, a mortal whose beauty rivaled Aphrodite's. That alone was enough to spark divine jealousy, but her story didn't end with petty rivalry. It spiraled into something far darker, a curse, a betrayal, and a redemption so hard-won it reshaped her soul. Aphrodite, furious at being overshadowed, commanded her son Eros to make Psyche fall for the ugliest creature alive. But instead of loathing, love struck them both. Eros, the god of desire, pierced his own heart with his arrow. He hid Psyche away in a palace of unseen wonders, visiting only under cover of night, forbidding her to ever look upon his face. Here's where trust shattered. Psyche's sisters, consumed by envy, whispered that her unseen lover must be a monster. Fear gnawed at her until one night, she raised an oil lamp over Eros as he slept. A drop of scalding oil fell on his shoulder. He awoke to her betrayal and vanished, leaving only a warning. Love cannot survive where there is no faith. Psyche's punishment was brutal. Aphrodite, seizing the chance to break her, imposed 4 impossible trials, sorting a mountain of mixed grains in a single night, fetching golden wool from man-eating sheep, filling a flask from the underworld's cursed river, and finally stealing a drop of Persephone's beauty. Each task was designed to crush her, yet somehow ants came to sort the grains. A reed whispered how to gather the wool without being torn apart. An eagle carried the flask to the river's source. And in the underworld, Persephone herself took pity. The final twist, Psyche's curiosity nearly doomed her again. Opening Persephone's gift, a box said to hold divine beauty, she fell into a death-like sleep. But Eros, his wings mended, swept in to wake her with a kiss. Zeus, moved by her trials, made her immortal. Their love, tested by fire and folly, became legend. What makes this myth timeless isn't just the happily ever after. It's the raw truth beneath the magic. Love demands vulnerability. Psyche's journey wasn't about winning a god's heart. It was about earning back trust, piece by broken piece. And in the end, even the gods had to admit mortal courage can touch the divine. The city of Troy didn't fall because of armies alone. It burned because the gods willed it. This wasn't just a war between men. It was a divine chess game with mortals as pawns and Olympus itself pulling the strings. It all began with a golden apple tossed into a wedding feast by Ares, the goddess of discord. Inscribed with the words, "For the fairest," it sparked a rivalry between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite that would echo through history. Paris, a Trojan prince, was chosen to judge their beauty. But this was no innocent contest. Each goddess offered a bribe. Hera promised power, Athena offered wisdom, and Aphrodite swore to give him the most beautiful woman in the world. His choice, Helen, already wed to the Spartan king Menelaus, would become the fuse for a war that consumed nations. What's chilling is how personal this divine vendetta became. When Paris took Helen to Troy, the spurned goddesses didn't just side with the Greeks, they hunted Troy. Hera, humiliated by Paris's rejection, turned the city's very walls against its people. Athena, her wisdom twisted into wrath, whispered strategies to Odysseus and Achilles, ensuring every Trojan loss was brutal and decisive. Even Zeus, who claimed neutrality, tilted the scales with storms and omens. Homer's Iliad paints their interference as capricious, almost casual gods swapping sides mid-battle, healing favored warriors or striking others down on a whim. But beneath the chaos there was a pattern. Troy was never meant to survive. Now, here's where the myth grows darker. The Hittite tablets, older than Homer by centuries, tell a different tale. In their version, Troy wasn't just a victim of Greek wrath. It was a player in a larger divine conflict. The Hittite storm god Tarhunt and the sea god were locked in their own struggle, with Troy caught between. Some scholars believe the Trojan War was a collision of pantheons, not just personal grudges. The Greeks rewrote the story, erased the older gods, and made it about their own deities' vendettas. But whether you read Homer or the Hittite fragments, one truth remains. Troy's destruction was never just about Helen. It was about pride, about gods who couldn't let a slight go unanswered. When the Greeks finally wheeled their wooden horse into the city, it wasn't just soldiers hiding inside, it was the weight of divine spite. and as Troy burned, the gods watched satisfied. Because for them, this wasn't a tragedy, it was justice. Hathor was never meant to be a killer. The Egyptian goddess of love, music, and joy, her very name meant House of Horus, a sanctuary of warmth and protection. But when Ra, the sun god, grew weary of humanity's rebellion, he reached for her like a weapon. He didn't just ask for her help, he transformed her. Her golden skin turned crimson, her gentle eyes burned with fire, and her laughter twisted into a roar. She became Sekhmet, the lioness of vengeance, unleashed upon the world with claws bared. The myth reads like a fever dream. Sekhmet rampaged across Egypt, her thirst for blood unquenchable. Villages vanished beneath her shadow. The Nile itself ran red, not with floodwaters, but with the remains of those who dared defy the gods. The terrifying genius of this story lies in its duality. The same goddess who could soothe a crying child with lullabies could also rip souls from bodies without hesitation. Love and destruction, two sides of the same divine coin, but here's where the myth takes a startling turn. Ra, watching the carnage, realized his mistake. Sekhmet wasn't just punishing humanity, she was losing herself to the slaughter. So he ordered his priests to brew thousands of jars of beer, dyed red with ochre to mimic blood. They poured the liquid across the fields at dawn, and when Sekhmet returned, she saw not a land of survivors, but a river of scarlet. She drank and drank until her limbs grew heavy, her rage softened, and she collapsed into a deep, drunken sleep. When she awoke, the bloodlust had passed, Hathor had returned. Now look deeper, and you'll find this isn't just a morality tale. The myth mirrors the Nile's annual floods, the life-giving waters that could also bring devastation if left unchecked. The red beer, scholars tie it to the Tek festival, where Egyptians poured offerings to pacify Sekhmet during the hottest days of summer, when the sun's wrath was fiercest. They feared the lioness not just as a destroyer, but as a force of nature, one that needed to be soothed, not slain. What lingers most hauntingly is how human the gods feel here. Ra's anger, Sekhmet's rampage, even the desperate trick with the beer, these aren't distant celestial events. They're acts of passion, regret, and cunning. The Egyptians understood something profound. Even the divine could lose control. And sometimes salvation comes not from strength, but from cleverness, from knowing when to temper fury with mercy. Hathor's story isn't about destruction. It's about balance, the delicate, ever-shifting line between love and rage, between the goddess who dances and the lioness who hunts. The Morrígan didn't just foretell Cuchulain's death, she orchestrated it. In Celtic myth, she was more than a goddess of war. She was war itself, a shape-shifting force of prophecy and doom, her voice tangled in the cries of ravens circling battlefields. When she first appeared to the young hero, it wasn't as a terrifying specter, but as a beautiful woman offering him her love and power. But Cuchulain, ever proud, refused her. That rejection sealed his fate. What followed was a dance of deception and destiny. The Morrígan haunted him in countless forms, a wolf snapping at his heels, an eel tripping him mid-duel, a crimson-spotted cow guiding his enemies. Each transformation was a whisper of the end creeping closer. In one brutal fight, she even took the shape of an old crone, washing his blood-stained armor in a river. He recognized the omen too late, but here's the chilling twist. The Morrígan wasn't just his tormentor. She was his dark counterpart. Where Cuchulain fought with blazing honor, she thrived in chaos. Where he sought glory, she savored the inevitability of loss. Their bond wasn't hatred, it was a twisted symbiosis. Even as she hounded him, she couldn't resist watching him fight, admiring the very defiance that doomed him. The ravens were her signature. To the Celts, their presence on a battlefield wasn't just scavenging. It was the Morrigan's gaze, picking out the next soul to claim. When Cuchulain finally fell, tied to a standing stone to die on his feet, legend says the first raven to land on his shoulder was her, not in triumph but in mourning. She'd won, yet the victory was hollow, because without him the war lost its brightest flame. This myth cuts deeper than most divine vendettas. It's not about punishment, it's about the cost of refusing to bend. The Morrigan's love was a test, and Cuchulain's refusal wasn't just pride. It was the unshakable belief that a mortal could outpace fate. In the end, he did, but only by becoming the legend she knew he'd have to be. And that's the cruelest prophecy of all. Sometimes the gods don't want to break you. They want to remake you, even if it kills you. Freyja's tears didn't fall like mortal sorrow, they burned. When her husband, Hathor, vanished into the winds, the Norse goddess of love didn't weep salt water. She wept gold. Each drop that hit the earth hardened into amber, a glowing testament to a grief so vast it transformed the very world. But this wasn't just a myth about loss. It was about duality, how Freyja, radiant as sunlight, also held dominion over Folkvanga, where half the slain warriors went after battle. Love and death woven together in her trembling hands. Picture her, clad in a falcon's feather cloak, flying across realms in search of Hathor, her cries scattering riches in her wake. The Norse didn't see gold as mere wealth, it was frozen longing, a divine ache made tangible. Even her famed necklace, Brisingamen, wasn't just adornment. Forged by dwarves in exchange for a knight, each of her favor, it shimmered with the same impossible tension that defined her: desire and sacrifice, beauty and bargaining. Yet Folkvanga reveals the deeper truth. While Odin took his chosen warriors to Valhalla, Freyja claimed her own share of the dead. Her hall, Sessrumnir, wasn't a place of feasting and glory, but of quiet reunion. Here, the slain didn't just fight for eternity. They rested, welcomed by a goddess who understood the cost of love. Some scholars argue this split reflects an older tradition, one where Freyja stood equal to Odin in power, her role as war chooser just as vital as his. But the myth twists further. In some tales, Hathor isn't just lost, he's a fleeting presence, returning only to leave again, a cycle as relentless as the seasons. Freyja's tears, then, aren't just sorrow, they're the price of loving something transient. The gold she scatters becomes the wealth of kings, the ransom of giants, the seed of greed and conflict. Even her grief fuels the world's hunger. What makes this story unforgettable isn't the magic, it's the raw humanity. Freyja isn't aloof in her divinity. She rages, she bargains, she weeps, and in doing so, she reminds us that the gods don't just rule over love and death, they bleed for it. Her tears aren't weakness. They're the molten core of what it means to love something you can't hold. Ishtar's love wasn't a gift, it was a weapon. The Mesopotamian goddess of love and war, her desire burned as fiercely as the stars she ruled. When she set her sights on Gilgamesh, the demigod king of Uruk, she didn't offer affection, she demanded surrender. "Be my husband," she declared, promising him riches, power, and a throne rivaling the gods themselves. But Gilgamesh, unlike Paris or Psyche, saw the trap hidden beneath her words. He knew her history. Her lovers didn't end up blessed, they ended broken. The shepherd turned into a wolf, the gardener transformed into a mole, the warrior Ishalanu castrated for refusing her, each a cautionary tale etched into the walls of time. Gilgamesh's rejection was brutal. He didn't just decline, he mocked her. He listed her victims like a prosecutor, accusing her of leaving, a trail of scorched hearts and ruined men. Ishtar's response wasn't tears, it was fire. She stormed to heaven, demanding her father, Anu, release the bull of heaven to ravage Uruk. And here's where the myth twists: the bull wasn't just a monster. It was a force of nature, its breath drying rivers, its hooves splitting the earth. Gilgamesh and Enkidu slew it, but the victory came at a cost. Enkidu's death soon after, a punishment engineered by the gods, was Ishtar's final, merciless blow. Yet this isn't just a story of wrath. Peel back the layers and you'll find Ishtar's duality. She wasn't just the scorned lover, she was the lifeblood of Mesopotamia. As Inanna, her earlier incarnation, she descended into the underworld and rose again, symbolizing the cycle of fertility and rebirth. Temples celebrated her as the mother of crops, the keeper of sacred sex rites, the one who made the date palms flourish. So why does the Epic of Gilgamesh paint her as so vengeful? The answer lies in power. Gilgamesh's defiance wasn't personal, it was political. By rejecting her, he rejected divine authority itself. The bull, the drought, Enkidu's death, they weren't just punishments. They were reminders no mortal, no matter how strong, could escape the gods' reach. But here's the irony. In the end, Gilgamesh's quest for immortality fails. He remains mortal while Ishtar's cult endured for millennia. Her temple still stood long after Uruk's walls crumbled. The real seduction in this myth isn't Ishtar's offer. It's the illusion of choice. Gilgamesh thought he could outwit the gods, but his story ends with him clutching a fading weed of eternal life, watching it slip through his fingers. Ishtar, meanwhile, remained, not just as a destroyer, but as the unyielding force that governed love and war, life and death. Because in Mesopotamia, you didn't worship the gods for their mercy. You worshipped them for their power, and Ishtar, she had enough to spare. Persephone's abduction wasn't just a kidnapping, it was the first winter. Picture the moment, a field of narcissus flowers, their golden heads nodding in the breeze, and the earth itself splitting open as Hades' chariot bursts forth. He doesn't ask, he doesn't negotiate. He grabs the goddess of spring and drags her into the underworld, leaving only trampled blossoms and a single discarded sandal behind. But this isn't just a story of divine entitlement. It's a mirror of the ancient world's deepest fear, the sudden, inexplicable disappearance of life itself. Demeter's grief didn't just shake Olympus, it starved the earth. The goddess of the harvest tore her robes, let her hair unravel, and wandered the world in human guise, refusing to let a single stalk of wheat rise while her daughter was gone. Famine spread like a shadow, trees withered mid-bloom, rivers ran dry, mortals starved, their prayers rising like smoke to gods who suddenly realized they too depended on Demeter's grace. The myth twists here, revealing a stunning truth. Even immortals are bound to the cycles they govern. Zeus, who turned a blind eye to Hades' act, now faced a rebellion of empty altars and silent temples. Yet the resolution wasn't simple justice. Hermes, sent to retrieve Persephone, found her changed. She'd eaten 6 pomegranate seeds in the underworld, a small act with colossal consequences. Those seeds bound her to Hades, not as a prisoner but as a queen. The compromise, 6 months below the earth, 6 above. And so the seasons turned, but dig deeper, and you'll find this myth wasn't just about explanation, it was about initiation. The Eleusinian Mysteries, secret rites held for over 2,000 years, promised initiates a glimpse beyond death's veil. Participants drank barley water mixed with mint, an echo of Persephone's last meal before her abduction. They endured darkness, then witnessed a sudden blaze of light symbolizing her return. What makes this story endure isn't just its poetry, it's the raw truth beneath the symbolism. Persephone isn't a passive victim, she's a goddess who transforms. Below the earth, she's no longer the maiden of flowers but the iron-willed ruler of spirits. Above, she brings life surging back. Demeter's wrath isn't just maternal, it's revolutionary, a reminder that even the gods must respect the balance, and Hades. He's not a villain, but a necessary force. Without the underworld's cold embrace, the earth's abundance would mean nothing. The genius of this myth lies in its refusal to simplify. Life, death, and rebirth aren't separate, they're threads of the same tapestry. Persephone's journey isn't a tragedy. It's the first love story between light and dark, a dance that keeps the world alive. Anat didn't conquer her enemies, she wore them. The Canaanite goddess of war and fertility didn't just defeat her foes, she strung their severed heads around her waist like a grisly belt, their lifeless hands dangling from her neck as trophies. This wasn't mere brutality, it was ritual. Every drop of blood spilled fed the earth. Every corpse left in her wake was an offering to the cycles of life and death she governed. In the Ugaritic texts, Anat doesn't just wage war, she becomes it. One tablet describes her bathing in the blood of warriors until the gore reaches her hips, laughing as she wades through the wreckage of armies. Another recounts how she massacred the soldiers of a rebellious city, then paused mid-carnage to kneel in the mud and plant seeds in the freshly blood-soaked soil. That's the paradox of Anat. Her violence wasn't senseless, it was generative. Like a storm that both destroys and nourishes, her wrath cleared the way for new growth. Now compare her to Inanna in Mesopotamia, who hung the corpses of her enemies on hooks like discarded robes after her descent into the underworld. Or Athena in Greece, born from Zeus's skull already armored, her wisdom inseparable from her prowess in battle. These goddesses share more than a thirst for combat. They embody the idea that creation and destruction are twins. Anat's blood-drenched feasts mirror Inanna's dance on the bones of the dead. Athena's strategic brilliance echoes Anat's ability to see war as both a weapon and a sacrament. But here's where Anat stands apart. Unlike Athena, who often fought alongside heroes, or Inanna, who used war as political theater, Anat reveled in the visceral act of slaughter. She didn't need justification or alliances. When her brother Baal, the storm god, was threatened by the sea god Yam, Anat didn't negotiate. She hacked Yam's servants into pieces, then demanded Baal's enemies be served to her like lambs to the slaughter. The texts describe her joy in the butchery, her lips stained with gore as if it were wine. Yet after the battles, she'd transform. The same hands that crushed skulls would cradle lambs. The voice that roared war cries would sing lullabies to the crops. Canaanite farmers invoked her not just for victory but for rain. That duality haunts every myth about her. Even her name hints at it. Some scholars link Anat to the word for spring, tying her to the season when the land wakes, hungry and fertile from the sleep of winter. The chilling beauty of Anat's myths lies in their refusal to soften her. She isn't a goddess who balances love and war, she erases the line between them. To worship her was to acknowledge a hard truth: life requires death. The wheat grows tall because the field was bloodied first. And sometimes the most terrifying forces aren't the ones that destroy, but the ones that destroy and bless in the same breath. Baldur's nightmares weren't just dreams, they were prophecies. The brightest of the Norse gods, beloved by all, began seeing visions of his own death. Not in battle, not by some grand foe, but by something small, unseen. His mother, Frigg, desperate to protect him, extracted oaths from every living thing: fire and water, iron and stone, even the whispering winds, that they would never harm him. The gods made a game of it, laughing as they hurled spears and stones at Baldur, watching them bounce harmlessly away. But Frigg had overlooked one plant. A fragile, trailing thing called mistletoe, too young to swear an oath, too insignificant to notice. Enter Loki, the trickster, who carved a dart from that very mistletoe. He didn't wield it himself, no, he placed it in the hands of Hathor, Baldur's blind brother, guiding his aim with a whisper. The dart flew, Baldur fell, and just like that, the god who symbolized light and joy was gone, his blood staining the halls of Asgard. Nanna, Baldur's wife, didn't scream or rage. Her grief was quieter, deeper. When they laid Baldur on his funeral ship, she walked aboard without a word, her hands clasped around a golden cup. Some say she died of a broken heart. Others claim she plunged a dagger into her chest, choosing the underworld over a world without him. Whatever the truth, her body was placed beside his, the ship set ablaze, their ashes mingling in the wind. But here's where the myth twists. Baldur's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was the first domino in Ragnarok's chain. The gods' failure to resurrect him, despite pleading with hell, proved even their power had limits. The world grew colder, darker, alliances fractured. Loki, bound in chains for his role in Baldur's death, vowed vengeance. And when he finally broke free, the chaos he unleashed would drown the 9 realms in fire and blood. The genius of this story lies in its inevitability. Balder, the one god who could have tempered Ragnarok's fury, was gone. His light extinguished, the shadows grew bolder. Nanna's suicide wasn't just love, it was surrender, an admission that some losses can't be undone. Even the Norse afterlife offers no reunion. Helheim keeps them apart, their love a ghost of what was. Yet in that despair, there's a haunting beauty. The Vikings didn't just see Balder's death as an end, they saw it as proof that even gods aren't immune to fate. The lesson wasn't about mourning, it was about staring into the coming storm and still choosing to light the pyre, to let the flames rise, because sometimes the greatest myths aren't about victory. They're about how we face the inevitable. Indra's battle with Vritra wasn't just a fight, it was the tectonic shift between chaos and cosmos. Picture the dawn of creation, when the universe was still a formless sea of darkness. Vritra, the serpent of drought, lay coiled around the waters of life, his massive body choking the rivers, his venom drying the clouds. Without rain, the earth cracked open like a skull, and even the gods grew weak with thirst. Indra, the storm god, young and brash, raised his lightning bolt, the Vajra, forged from the bones of a sage. But this wasn't just a weapon, it was a covenant. The heavens themselves shuddered as he struck, splitting Vritra's belly, releasing the torrents that would nourish the world. Yet victory came with a price. Vritra wasn't just a monster, he was a Brahmin, a being of sacred knowledge. His death stained Indra's hands with a sin so heavy it forced him into hiding. The Rigveda paints his guilt in vivid strokes. He flees to the farthest reeds of a lake, hollowed out by shame, while Nahusha, a mortal, seizes his throne. Here's where the myth deepens. Indra's purification wasn't just an act of penance, it was a rebirth. The gods performed the Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice, its smoke scouring his spirit clean. But even then, the stain lingered. Some texts whisper that Vritra's curse followed Indra through the ages, a shadow that darkened his triumphs. Now step back and see the layers. Vritra's name means the enveloper, a force of resistance, of stagnation. Indra's lightning isn't just destruction, it's the spark of change, the violent necessity of growth. The Vedas don't glorify this battle as pure heroism. They frame it as a paradox. For order to exist, chaos must bleed. For life to drink, death must first open the floodgates. The ritual purification reveals another truth. In Vedic tradition, even gods aren't above cosmic law. Indra's guilt mirrors the human condition, the cost of leadership, the burden of choices that reshape worlds. His exile isn't punishment, it's reflection. And when he returns, it's not as a conqueror, but as a flawed sovereign, forever marked by the serpent's blood. What makes this myth timeless isn't the clash of titans. It's the uneasy balance it exposes. Indra and Vritra aren't opposites, they're entwined, like storm and drought. One cannot exist without the other, and perhaps that's the real revelation. The gods don't defeat chaos. They dance with it, their feet stained with the same mud they claim to rule. Midir didn't fall in love with Athene just once. He loved her across lifetimes, through bodies, beyond death itself. Their story begins in the other world, where Midir, a king of the Tuatha Danann, first saw Athene dancing in his halls, her feet barely touching the ground as if she were made of light and wind. But their love sparked jealousy in Midir's first wife, Fiumnak, who didn't just curse Athene, she erased her. With a flick of dark magic, Fiumnak transformed Athene into a butterfly, then hurled her into a storm so fierce it carried her across centuries. Here's where fate twists. The butterfly Athene, battered by winds, finally fell into the cup of a mortal queen who swallowed her unknowingly. Reborn as a human, Athene grew up with no memory of Midir or the otherworld, her past life nothing but a faint stirring in her dreams. Yet Midir never stopped searching. When he finally found her again, she was married to Eirchaid, the High King of Ireland. Midir didn't storm the palace or demand her back, he played the long game. Disguised as a stranger, he challenged Eirchaid to a game of fidchel, wagering treasures and land, each loss drawing him closer to his true prize, his final demand. A kiss from Athene, but the myth isn't just about persistence. It's about sovereignty, the right to choose one's own path. When Medea revealed himself in his true radiant form, Athene didn't recoil. She remembered the moment their hands touched, the centuries between them collapsed, and she chose to leave the mortal world behind, flying with Medea as swans toward the west. Eochaid, desperate, dug up every Shia mound in Ireland, trying to reclaim what was never truly his. He found nothing but echoes. Now dig deeper, and you'll find this myth isn't unique to Ireland. Compare it to Orpheus and Eurydice, where love fights death but fails at the final moment. Medea succeeds where Orpheus falters because he understands the rules of the game. The other world doesn't reward brute force. It rewards patience, cunning, and respect for the cycles of time. Athene's transformations from goddess to butterfly to mortal queen aren't punishments. They're tests, and Medea's victory lies not in taking her back, but in waiting until she could choose him freely. The most haunting detail: the story doesn't end with their reunion. Some versions whisper that Athene was reborn again, this time as the daughter of an Ulster king, her fate still tangled with Medea's, because in Irish myth, love isn't linear. It spirals, loops, and returns as inevitable as the tide. And sovereignty isn't just about ruling land, it's about owning one's story, even across lifetimes. Medea and Athene teach us this. The heart doesn't measure time in years, but in moments of recognition. And sometimes the truest love stories aren't those that end, but those that refuse to. The flower wars weren't battles, they were feasts. The Aztecs called them Xochitl, wars of flowers, but don't let the delicate name fool you. These were meticulously orchestrated clashes, fought not for land or gold, but to satisfy the sun god Huitzilopochtli's hunger. Every dawn, he wielded his fiery shield, Tenatia, to push back the stars and keep the world from slipping into eternal night. But his strength came at a price: blood, fresh and flowing. Without it, the sun would stagger, the crops would wither, and the fifth world, the Aztecs' own era, would collapse into darkness. Imagine warriors clad in jaguar pelts and quetzal feathers, obsidian blades glinting in the sun, lining up on a sacred field called Cuauhtlali. This wasn't chaotic slaughter, it was ritual as precise as a dance. Captives, not corpses, were the prize. Fighters aimed to disable, not kill, to drag their enemies alive to the temple steps where priests waited with flint knives. The myth cuts deeper here. Huitzilopochtli didn't just demand sacrifice, he embodied it. Born from his mother Coatlicque's womb fully armed, he'd slaughtered his sister Coilxauhqui and her 400 star brothers, casting their bodies down the sacred mountain. Now every offering repeated that primal victory. Chaos ordered, darkness beaten back, but here's where history twists the story. Spanish chroniclers painted the flower wars as mindless barbarity, missing the terrible logic beneath. These weren't random raids, they were treaties in motion. Rival city-states like Tlaxcala and Huexotzinco agreed to fight on designated fields, balancing the scales of tribute and terror. The battles kept the gods fed and the empire's enemies in check, their warriors drained but their cities left standing. A macabre symbiosis. Archaeology shatters another illusion. The flower wars weren't gentle. Excavations at the Templo Maya reveal skull racks holding tens of thousands, their bones scored with butcher marks. Victims weren't just prisoners of war, they were Tiamatqui, those who died for the gods, transformed into divine messengers. Their blood wasn't wasted, it was sprinkled on maize fields, their flesh shared in ritual feasts. The Aztecs saw no cruelty in this. To them, death was a transaction, a life given willingly or taken forcefully to keep the cosmos spinning. Yet the darkest truth lies in the numbers. During droughts or eclipses, the flower wars escalated. When the sun faltered, the gods' hunger grew desperate. Ordinary battles couldn't sate it, so the Aztecs turned inward, sacrificing their own children coated in chalk to mimic the corn god Sintiotl. Women dressed as the maize goddess Chichimequotl. Even the flowery battles became bloodier, the line between ritual and necessity blurring. Huitzilopochtli's demand wasn't just myth, it was ecology written in scarlet. The sun needed fuel, the earth demanded payment, and the Aztecs, caught between heaven and hunger, fed the fire until the Spanish arrived with their own gods, their own wars, and a new kind of sacrifice, extinction. The flower wars didn't end, they were swallowed, but the echoes linger in the way we still bargain with forces greater than ourselves, trading pieces of our humanity to keep the light burning. Hera's hatred for Heracles wasn't just divine spite, it was a storm centuries in the making. Picture this: the moment Zeus's latest bastard son drew his first breath, Hera didn't merely send a snake to his crib. She sent two, their fangs dripping with venom meant for a demigod still swaddled in linen. But the infant Heracles didn't scream. He choked the serpents to death with his tiny fists, their coils limp around his wrists like macabre bracelets. This wasn't just a test of strength, it was the first volley in a war that would span his entire life. Now, here's what most myths gloss over. Hera's vendetta wasn't really about Heracles. His very name, Hera's glory, was a taunt, a reminder that Zeus had stolen another woman's child and thrust him into the pantheon's spotlight. Every labor, every torment Hera engineered echoed the same unspoken question: why must I suffer his existence while my own children fade into the background? Even Hephaestus, her son, was cast from Olympus for being imperfect. Yet Zeus's illegitimate heirs got thrones, constellations, and cults. The madness was her masterpiece. With a whisper, Hera coiled her will around Heracles' mind until he saw not his wife and children, but monsters clawing at his heels. When the fog lifted, their bodies lay at his feet, his hands stained with the only blood he'd never meant to spill. Some versions claim Hera watched from the shadows, satisfied, but older tablets from Thebes paint a different scene, the goddess turning away, her face unreadable, as if even she couldn't bear the weight of what she'd done. That's the unsettling truth lurking beneath the myth. Hera wasn't just wrath, she was grief wearing a crown. Every time Zeus strayed, her fury wasn't just at the betrayal but at the injustice. Mortals painted her as the shrew, the nag, the villain of Olympus, but what if her pursuit of Heracles was the only power she had left? In a world where Zeus's whims were law, her vengeance became her voice. Yet even she couldn't break him. The 12 labors designed to destroy Heracles only cemented his legend, with each impossible task slaying the Nemean lion, stealing the golden apples of the Hesperides. He didn't just survive Hera's traps, he transcended them. By the time he ascended to godhood, her hatred had hollowed into something resembling respect, or maybe exhaustion. The final irony: when Heracles died, consumed by poisoned robes, it wasn't Hera's hand that killed him. It was his own wife's misguided love, an echo of the same domestic ruin Hera had inflicted years before. The goddess of marriage might have even wept not for him but for the cruel symmetry of it all. Because in the end, her greatest enemy wasn't Heracles, it was the cycle itself, Zeus's betrayals, her rage, the endless spinning of tragedies neither could escape. Some say she welcomed him on Olympus at last, a truce forged in shared suffering, but the myths leave that part hazy. Maybe because even the storytellers knew some wounds never close. They just scar over, thick and ragged, reminders of what happens when love curdles into something too sharp to hold. Circe's island wasn't just a prison, it was a sanctuary. When Odysseus's men stumbled upon her palace, they expected hospitality, not horror. But Circe, the witch of Aiaia, didn't just turn them into swine with a flick of her wand. She revealed a truth about power that runs like a dark current through her myth. Transformation isn't always punishment. Sometimes it's mercy. Think about it. These weren't noble warriors she cursed, they were pirates, raiders who'd spent years pillaging coastal towns. As pigs, they rooted in the dirt, free from the weight of their crimes. Circe's magic stripped them of their violence, leaving only simple hunger. And when Odysseus arrived, armed with Hermes' protective herb moly, she didn't fight him. She recognized him. Here was a man whose cunning matched her own, a traveler who'd already faced monsters and gods. Their encounter wasn't a battle, it was a negotiation. For a year, Odysseus stayed, not as a captive but as a companion. Circe's herbs weren't just poisons, they were keys to forgotten knowledge. She taught him how to navigate the underworld, whispering which plants could ease the passage between life and death. Some versions of the myth even suggest she was the one who revealed his fate. The loss of his crew, the suitors waiting in Ithaca, the long journey home that would cost him everything. Now here's where the story deepens. Later traditions, often overshadowed by Homer's epic, claim Circe bore Odysseus a son, Telegonus, and this isn't just a footnote, it's a reckoning. When Telegonus grows up, he sets out to find his father but mistakes Ithaca for enemy shores. His spear, tipped with the venom of a stingray, a gift from Circe, accidentally kills Odysseus. The irony is brutal. The man who survived sirens and cyclopes falls to his own son, armed with a weapon his lover crafted. But Circe's legacy isn't just tragedy. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, she's not a villain but a woman scorned, turning the nymph Scylla into a monster out of jealousy. Ancient herbalists credited her with discovering antidotes to poisons, her name invoked in healing charms. Even the word pharmakon, Greek for both remedy and poison, echoes her duality. She wasn't just a witch, she was the original alchemist, understanding that the line between cure and curse is thinner than a petal. What makes Circe unforgettable isn't her magic, it's her agency. While other enchantresses in myth exist to tempt or trap heroes, Circe operates on her own terms. She doesn't beg Odysseus to stay, she doesn't weep when he leaves, she gives him the tools to survive, knowing full well he'll never return. And when Telegonus brings his father's body back to Aia, she doesn't rage at the gods. She buries Odysseus beside the sea, the waves her only mourners. This is the real spell Circe casts. She forces us to see her not as a monster, but as a mirror. Her island isn't a cage, it's a choice. Every man who comes ashore gets what he deserves, either the beast he hides or the truth he's been running from. And Odysseus, he got both. Tyr's hand wasn't just lost, it was gambled. The Norse god of war and justice stood before Fenrir, the monstrous wolf whose growth knew no bounds, and made a deal no other deity dared. The gods, terrified of Fenrir's unchecked power, had tried to chain him twice with forged links named Leidinga and Dromi. Twice the wolf shattered them like twigs. Now they presented a third fetter, Gleipnir, crafted from impossibilities, the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain. Thin as silk, yet stronger than fate itself, but Fenrir wasn't fooled. He sensed the trick, so he demanded a pledge. One of the gods must place their hand in his jaws as collateral. If the bonds held, the hand would be forfeit. Only Tyr stepped forward. Think about that for a moment. Odin, the All-Father, who'd once sacrificed his eye for wisdom, stayed silent. Thor, who'd faced giants and serpents, hesitated. But Tyr, the god whose very name meant justice, extended his right hand, the hand of oaths, into the wolf's maw. When Gleipnir held fast and Fenrir realized he'd been betrayed, the bite wasn't just physical, it was cosmic. Tyr's sacrifice wasn't about strength, it was about honor. He'd given his word, knowing full well the cost. Now compare this to Odin's hanging on Yggdrasil. Both acts are sacrifices, but where Odin's was solitary, inward, a quest for knowledge, Tyr's was communal, outward. Odin pierced himself with his own spear. Tyr's wound was given by another, a transaction of trust and consequence. And here's the twist, both sacrifices bind chaos. Odin's ordeal secured the runes, the symbols of order. Tyr's loss secured Fenrir until Ragnarök, delaying the inevitable, but the myth doesn't end with the bite. Later at Ragnarök, Fenrir breaks free. His jaws, now wide enough to swallow the sky, will devour Odin whole. Tyr, meanwhile, faces Garma, the hound of hell, and they slay each other. The symmetry is chilling. The god who sacrificed his hand to the wolf falls to the wolf's kin. The threads of fate weave back on themselves, proving no debt goes unpaid. What makes this story resonate isn't just the gore, it's the quiet dignity in Tyr's choice. The Norse didn't glorify his pain, they honored his integrity. In a pantheon where gods often lied and schemed, Tyr stood apart. His sacrifice wasn't just about restraining a monster, it was about upholding the rules of the game, even when the game was rigged. Because without trust, even among enemies, the world crumbles into chaos, and sometimes the price of order is a piece of yourself. Inanna's descent into the underworld wasn't a journey, it was a dismantling. The Sumerian goddess of love and war didn't just walk into Kur, the land of the dead. She unmade herself at each of its 7 gates. Her crown, her lapis beads, her royal robe, stripped away one by one until she stood naked, powerless, kneeling before her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. The verdict was swift. Inanna would hang lifeless on a hook, her corpse rotting like meat. But this isn't just a story of divine punishment. It's a map of the human soul's darkest passage and the brutal price of returning. When Inanna finally clawed her way back to life, thanks to the cunning of her advisor Ninshubur and the magic of Inki, the underworld's laws demanded a replacement. Her gaze fell on Dumuzid, her shepherd consort, who hadn't mourned her absence. Instead, he'd lounged on her throne, adorned in her finery, reveling in her power. Inanna's wrath was instant. She pointed at him, uttering a single word, him. The demons of Kur seized Dumuzid, dragging him screaming into the abyss. But the myth doesn't end there. Dumuzid's sister, Inanna, loved him fiercely. When she learned of his fate, she struck a bargain. She would take his place for half the year, trading portions of eternity in the underworld so he could return to the sunlit world. And so their cycle began, 6 months of decay, 6 months of renewal. Now, here's where the soil speaks. The Sumerians didn't just see this as a lover's quarrel. Dumuzid wasn't merely a god, he was the spirit of the grain. His death mirrored the harvest when barley was cut and stored in dark silos, his rebirth. The first green shoots breaking through winter's crust. Inanna, whose name means vine of heaven, embodied the grapevine's dormancy and resurgence. Together, they mapped the rhythm of famine and feast that sustained Mesopotamia. Archaeology whispers another layer. Cylinder seals show Dumuzid with goats, animals that graze on tender new growth, threatening the fragile balance of rebirth. Inanna's condemnation wasn't just anger, it was necessity. For the fields to flourish, the shepherd had to fall. The real power of this myth lies in its refusal to soften the truth. Inanna isn't a compassionate goddess. She's life itself, merciless, cyclical, demanding sacrifice. And Dumuzid, he's not an innocent victim. He's the part of us that clings to comfort, blind to the cost of survival. Their story isn't about love. It's about the bargain every civilization makes. To eat, something must die. To live, something must burn. Krishna didn't win the Kurukshetra war with arrows or armies, he won it with words. When the Pandavas stood on the brink of annihilation, facing the endless Kaurava forces, their divine charioteer waged a different kind of battle, his weapons. Loopholes, half-truths, and the unsettling brilliance of a mind that saw morality as fluid. Take Bhishma, the grandsire bound by his vow to protect Hastinapura's throne. Krishna knew the old warrior would never break his word, so he placed Shikundi, born a woman and thus immune to Bhishma's oath against fighting females, in Arjuna's path. Bhishma, recognizing the trick, lowered his bow. His principles became his coffin. Then there was Drona, the invincible teacher who could only be killed once stripped of his will to fight. Krishna orchestrated the cruelest lie of all, the death of Drona's son Ashwatthama. Except the Ashwatthama slain was an elephant, not the warrior. When Yudhishthira, the paragon of truth, whispered, "Ashwatthama is dead," he added the elephant under his breath, a half-truth drowned out by conch shells. Drona's grief shattered his focus and his head rolled in the dust. But the heart of Krishna's strategy wasn't just deception, it was philosophy. The Bhagavad Gita, spoken on that bloodied battlefield, reframed the entire war. Arjuna's despair at killing kin wasn't met with comfort but with cold logic. The soul is eternal, the body a temporary vessel. Duty, not emotion, must guide action. Krishna's divine form revelation, a cosmos of endless mouths devouring warriors, wasn't just awe-inspiring. It was a warning: resistance to destiny is futile. Critics argue these tactics stain Krishna's divinity. How can a god justify lying? But the Mahabharata isn't a tale of clear heroes. It's a grey expanse where Dharma bends like a reed in the wind. Krishna's tricks weren't about winning a war, they were about restoring balance. When oaths become shackles and virtue turns suicidal, perhaps the only true morality is the one that preserves life itself. The chilling beauty of Krishna's strategy lies in its duality. He was both charioteer and chessmaster, loving friend and ruthless tactician. His legacy isn't just victory, it's the unbearable question: when the world is rigged, do you play fair or do you break the game? Izanagi and Izanami's love didn't just create the Japanese islands, it split the world between the living and the dead. When the two gods stood on the floating bridge of heaven, stirring the primordial sea with their jeweled spear, the drops that fell formed land. But their union was more than creation, it was a delicate dance of balance. Izanami, the first to speak during their marriage ritual, broke the natural order. Her assertiveness cursed their first child, Haruko, who was born boneless and set adrift in a reed boat. Only when Izanagi took the lead did their union produce the 8 perfect islands of Japan. Then came the fire god Kagetsuchi's birth, an event so violent it burned Izanami alive. Her death wasn't just tragedy, it was a rupture in the cosmos. Izanagi, mad with grief, followed her into Yomi, the underworld, but what he found there shattered him. The once radiant Izanami was now rotting, her flesh crawling with maggots, her body fused with the decay of the land of the dead. She wasn't his wife anymore, she was defilement itself. Here's where the myth turns into a reckoning. Izanagi's flight wasn't cowardice. In Shinto belief, death isn't just an end, it's kegare, a spiritual pollution so potent it disrupts the purity of life. When Izanagi looked upon Izanami's corpse, he didn't just see horror, he violated a sacred taboo. Her rage at his repulsion wasn't personal, it was the fury of the underworld which demands acknowledgement, not abandonment. The demons she sent after him weren't just chasing a fleeing husband, they were enforcing the boundary between the clean and the unclean. Izanagi's escape rituals reveal Shinto's deepest fears. He washed himself in the river Takebana, purifying the death stench from his body. Where his left eye dripped water, Amaterasu, the sun goddess, was born. From his right eye came Tsukuyomi, the moon god. His nose birthed Susanoo, the storm deity. These weren't just new gods, they were acts of purification, the remnants of death transformed into celestial order. Yet Izanami's curse lingered. Her final words that she would take 1,000 lives each day met Izanagi's promise to birth 1,500 in response. This wasn't reconciliation, it was a cosmic standoff, the first acknowledgement that life and death are locked in eternal competition. The haunting beauty of this myth lies in its refusal to sanitize grief. Izanagi doesn't get a happy ending. He's left scarred, exiled from the underworld, and his beloved forced to accept that some boundaries can't be crossed twice. And Izanami, she rules Yomi not as a villain but as a sovereign of the inevitable. Their love created the world, their separation defined its rules. Because in Shinto, to look back is to risk bringing the rot with you, and some doors, once closed, must never be reopened. Brynhilde didn't choose the mortal world, it chose her. A Valkyrie, one of Odin's fierce shield maidens tasked with selecting the slain for Valhalla, she was no mere servant of fate. Her defiance began with a single act of mercy, sparing a warrior Odin had marked for death. Some versions say it was the hero Agnar whose courage moved her, others whisper it was her own secret love for a mortal king. Whatever the reason, her disobedience was a spark in dry tinder. Odin's punishment was cruel in its precision. He stripped her of divinity, trapped her in a ring of fire atop a mountain, and decreed she'd remain there until a man brave enough to pass through the flames claimed her. But this wasn't just banishment, it was a trap, because Brynhilde, even mortal, would never bow to a love she didn't choose. Enter Sigurd, the dragon slayer, who rode through the flames not as a conqueror but as an equal. Their bond wasn't the stuff of pretty ballads. It was raw, mutual recognition, two warriors who saw the other's soul laid bare. They swore oaths on swords, traded wisdom like weapons, and planned a future beyond the whims of gods. But Norse myths don't deal in happy endings. A potion of forgetfulness, a trickster's scheme, and Sigurd's eventual betrayal would unravel their vows. Brynhilde's vengeance was legendary. She orchestrated Sigurd's murder, then threw herself onto his funeral pyre, choosing death over a world that had broken her twice. The chilling truth, Odin's punishment wasn't really about Brynhilde's defiance. It was about control. Valkyries existed in a liminal space, women with the power to decide who lived, who died, and who feasted in Odin's hall. Their autonomy threatened the very order of Asgard. Look at Kara, another Valkyrie who loved a mortal king, Helgi. When she interfered in his battles, guiding his strikes with her swan's wings, Odin didn't just curse her, he ensured Helga's blade accidentally killed her mid-flight. The message was clear, even divine women who stepped out of line would pay in blood, but the sagas hint at something darker. In the Hellwraith Brynhilde rides to hell not as a victim but as a seeress prophesying Odin's downfall. Her final words aren't of regret but of triumph. The High One will come to my pyre, the one who broke his own laws. Even in death she twists the knife. Because Brynhilde's story isn't just about love or punishment. It's about the cost of sovereignty in a world where gods and men alike demanded obedience. The Valkyries' tales are littered with these silent rebellions. Sigrun, who abandoned her post to marry Helgi, only to watch him die by her own family's hands. Herva, who wielded a cursed sword to avenge her father, defying both graves and gods. What unites them isn't tragedy, it's choice. They knew the price of defiance and paid it anyway. And perhaps that's why these stories endure, not as cautionary tales but as embers, reminders that even in the coldest shadows of fate, someone somewhere is still daring to burn. Cassiopeia's crime wasn't vanity, it was defiance. The Queen of Ethiopia didn't just claim her daughter, Andromeda was more beautiful than the Nereids, Poseidon's sea nymphs. She dared to place mortal grace above divine perfection, a transgression that shook the very foundations of the cosmic order, but the punishment wasn't aimed at Cassiopeia. It landed squarely on Andromeda, chained naked to a cliff as sacrifice to the sea monster Cetus. The brutality of this myth isn't just about hubris, it's about who pays the price when women speak too boldly. Poseidon's wrath followed a familiar pattern. Like Hera's torment of Heracles or Artemis' vengeance on Niobe, the gods often redirected their fury onto the innocent. Cassiopeia's words may have sparked the crisis, but Andromeda's body became the battleground. The imagery is impossible to ignore. A young woman bound by her own father's orders, her fate decided by male gods and kings, while her mother's voice, the original provocation, faded into the background. Some versions of the myth even suggest Cassiopeia was forced to watch, her throne turned to face the sea as eternal penance. A queen humiliated, a daughter displayed like meat, and a kingdom held hostage to divine pettiness. Yet there's another layer here. Andromeda's sacrifice wasn't the end of the story, it was the setup for Perseus' heroics. The demigod swooped in, slew the monster, and claimed her as his bride, wrapping the trauma in the gloss of a happy ending. But look closer. Andromeda had already been promised to another man, Phineus, whose rage at losing her led to a bloodbath at their wedding feast. Perseus turned Phineus and his allies to stone with Medusa's head, adding more corpses to the pile. The myth wants us to see this as justice, but it's hard to ignore the pattern. every solution involves another man's violence, another woman's silence. The real question isn't whether Cassiopeia deserved punishment. It's why the system demanded a daughter's suffering to balance a mother's pride. Compare this to Arachne, transformed into a spider for challenging Athena's weaving skills, or Medusa, cursed for Poseidon's assault in Athena's temple. Time and again, ancient myths punish women for disrupting the hierarchy, whether through words, beauty, or sheer existence. Cassiopeia's story endures not as a warning against arrogance, but as a dark mirror of how power polices women's voices. Even in her celestial punishment, forever circling the North Star upside down on her throne, the message is clear: step out of line, and the cosmos itself will make sure you never forget your place. But here's the twist the stars don't show. Cassiopeia's constellation is one of the most recognizable in the night sky. However you spin her story, she's still up there, unignorable, eternal, her throne etched in starlight. Maybe that's the quiet rebellion buried in the myth. They could chain her daughter, humiliate her, hinge her legacy on tragedy, but they couldn't erase her. Some silences, it turns out, echo louder than screams. The Fomorians didn't rule the sea, they were the sea. Ancient Ireland's most feared gods, these towering, misshapen beings weren't just monsters. They were embodiments of the ocean's cruelty, storm-dark, salt-scarred, and bound by oaths written in blood. Their leader, Balor of the Evil Eye, didn't just kill his enemies. His lidless gaze was a weapon so horrific, his own warriors kept it sealed under 7 layers of leather until battle. Then, with a grisly ritual, they'd peel back the bindings, and the mere sight of his pupil swollen, venomous, pulsing with death, would rot flesh from bone. But here's the twist: Balor's power wasn't just a curse, it was a bargain. Every time he unleashed his eye, it drained his own life force, a reminder that even gods pay for destruction. Now dig deeper, and you'll find the Fomorians' oaths weren't just about loyalty. They were symbiotic. When Brez the Beautiful, half Fomorian, half Tuatha De Danann, seized the throne of Ireland through treachery, his rule wasn't upheld by strength alone. It relied on a web of grotesque pacts. Farmers swore to give 2/3 of their children's milk to Fomorian overlords, leaving infants to starve. Blacksmiths forged weapons day and night, their furnaces fed by their own breath. These weren't mere tributes, they were spells, binding mortals to the Fomorians' will through suffering. But the darkest oath belonged to Balor himself. A druid once prophesied he'd be slain by his own grandchild, so he locked his daughter Ethlyn in a crystal tower, letting no man near her. Yet love, as always, found a way. Scion of the Tuatha De Danann tricked his way inside, and their child, Lug, was smuggled to safety. Years later, at the Battle of Moytura, Lug, now a radiant sun god, would hurl a stone from his sling straight into Balor's eye, the force so great it blasted the venomous orb backward through his skull, poisoning his own army. The irony: Balor's murderous eye, the very thing he wielded to enforce his rule, became his downfall. The Fomorians' reliance on brutal oaths twisted back on them. Brez, once a tyrant, was captured and spared only after revealing the secrets of plowing and harvest, proof that even chaos must yield to order. What makes this myth unforgettable isn't just the gore. It's the haunting truth beneath the waves. No empire built on fear lasts forever. The Tuatha De Danann's victory wasn't just about magic or might. It was about breaking the cycle, refusing to let terror write the next chapter. And in the echoes of that battle, you can still hear the whisper of the sea, not as a conqueror, but as a warning. Zeus didn't just seduce, he transformed. His conquests weren't romantic trysts, they were acts of divine subterfuge, each disguise a carefully crafted weapon of desire. Take Leda, queen of Sparta, who found herself face to face not with a god but with a swan, its wings thrashing, its neck coiled in false panic as it sought refuge in her arms. Or Europa, frolicking by the shore when a bull, white as sea foam and radiating unnatural calm, knelt at her feet. These weren't whimsical shape-shifting tricks. They were calculated manipulations tailored to exploit vulnerability. A swan plays on compassion, a bull on curiosity, golden rain on greed. Zeus didn't just want consent, he wanted surrender, the moment when mortal awe overrode self-preservation. But peel back the layers and these myths crackle with deeper meaning. Could the swan be more than a disguise? Ancient Greeks saw swans as liminal creatures, bridging water and sky, just as Zeus bridged the divine and mortal realms. His bull form mirrors sacred rituals across the Mediterranean, where bulls symbolized both fertility and raw, untamed power. Even the golden rain that birthed Perseus might echo the sun's rays piercing storm clouds, a celestial metaphor for divine intervention. Some scholars argue these tales encode natural phenomena, the bull as earthquake, the swan as flood spun into narratives to explain the unexplainable. Then there's the political lens. Europa's abduction didn't just spawn a love story. It gave Crete a divine pedigree, linking its kings to Zeus's bloodline. Her name, meaning wide-faced, may hint at the expansive reach of Minoan trade networks. Likewise, Leda's offspring Helen of Troy among them became pawns in dynastic wars, their mythic origins legitimizing Spartan hegemony. Zeus's seductions weren't just personal, they were imperial, weaving mortal kingdoms into the cosmic order through forced divine kinship, the darkest twist. Resistance was never an option. When Danae, locked in a bronze tower by her father, was impregnated by Zeus's golden shower, her confinement mirrored the fate of countless royal women traded like chattel. The gods mirrored mortal patriarchy, their seductions echoing the real-world subjugation of women under the guise of destiny. Yet these myths refuse to be reduced to mere allegory. They pulse with ambiguity. Is Europa's ride across the sea on the bull's back a kidnapping or a coronation? Does Leda's union with the swan represent violation or apotheosis, her body the crucible for Helen's world-shattering beauty? Zeus's disguises expose a haunting truth. Divinity doesn't ask permission, it imposes, and in that imposition, it forces us to confront the messy intersection of power, desire, and the stories we tell to justify both. The battle between Horus and Set wasn't about light versus darkness, it was a cosmic storm meeting the unyielding sun. Most retellings paint Set as the villain, the usurper who murdered Osiris and tore Egypt into chaos, while Horus, the falcon-headed avenger, emerges as the golden hero. But the oldest spells from the pyramid texts whisper a different truth. Set wasn't just chaos, he was the desert's roar, the thunder that split the sky, the necessary fury that guarded Ra's solar bark from the serpent Apophis each night. Without him, even the sun would falter. Horus's path to kingship was anything but clean. In one brutal clash, Set ripped out his left eye, the moon itself shattering its light into fragments. Thoth, the god of wisdom, stitched it back together, but the restored Ujjat eye wasn't just healed. It was transformed, a symbol of sacrifice and renewal. Later, in a shocking reversal, Horus didn't just defeat Set, he seduced him. A fragment from the Chester Beatty papyrus describes a banquet where Horus tricks Set into drinking his semen, a humiliation so profound it stripped Set's power at its root. Yet even then, the gods didn't banish Set. They bound him to the prow of Ra's boat, his screams warding off chaos. The contradictions pile up like desert sand. In some temples, Set and Horus stand side by side, their rivalry reconciled, twin forces balancing Mat order against Isfet disorder. In others, Set is the eternal adversary, his red hair a mark of shame. The shift wasn't just theological, it was political. Early dynasties venerated Set as Upper Egypt's patron, but when Lower Egypt's influence grew, Horus eclipsed him. Kings rewrote the myth to suit their reigns, turning a divine tug of war into propaganda. Perhaps the most haunting detail comes from the contendings of Horus and Set, where the trial for Osiris's throne drags on for 80 years. The gods vacillate, Isis schemes, and even Ra, the supreme judge, hesitates. Why? Because both gods are right. Horus inherits through bloodline set through conquest. The myth mirrors Egypt's own cycles, dynasties rising and falling, deserts encroaching on fertile land, the Nile's predictable floods against the desert's unpredictable wrath. The lesson here isn't victory, but tension. Horus wins, but Set endures. Order prevails, but chaos remains coiled beneath the throne, because the Egyptians knew a truth we often forget. No light exists without shadow, no harvest without drought, no king without the storm that tests him. The Tuatha De Danann didn't vanish in fire or fury, they faded like mist at dawn. Their final battle wasn't against gods or monsters, but against the very people they once ruled, the Milesians, mortal invaders who carried the weight of iron and the scent of salt on their skin. The clash wasn't epic, it was eerily quiet. The Dagda's harp no longer stirred hearts to war. Lug's spear faltered in his grip. Even Morrigan's prophecies dissolved into whispers. When the dust settled, the gods struck a bargain not for victory but for oblivion. They would retreat underground into the hollow hills and shimmering Shia mounds, leaving the surface world to men. But this wasn't defeat, it was transformation. Christian monks centuries later would scribe their stories with ink instead of ogham, reshaping the Tuatha De Danann into something palatable for a new era. No longer gods, they became fairy folk, diminished but not gone. The Dagda's cauldron of plenty, a quaint peasant tale, Brigid's sacred flames repurposed into saintly devotion. Even Lug, the radiant sun god, was Chinese letter into a footnote, his name lingering in festivals like Lugnasad, stripped of its blood and thunder, but the monks couldn't erase everything. The old gods seeped through the parchment. Take the Liber Gabala Eren, the Book of Invasions. Here, the Tuatha De Danann are demoted to merely another wave of settlers, not deities. Yet their magic lingers in the margins. Nuada's silver arm, once a symbol of kingship, becomes a curious detail in a saint's vita. Manannán mac Lur's cloak of illusion. A sailor's superstition, but in the countryside, farmers still left offerings at hawthorn trees, fearing the wrath of the good people. The gods didn't die, they went underground both literally and metaphorically. The irony is brutal. The Milesians who drove the Tuatha De Danann into myth would later beg for their blessings. Kings sought the Morrigan's favor before battle, though they called her by other names. Poets invoked Brigid's inspiration, even as they scribbled crosses in the margins. The god's power didn't vanish, it shapeshifted, slipping into the cracks of hymns and folktales. Perhaps the most haunting survival is the She, the ferry mounds. To this day, road crews in Ireland divert highways around them, a silent acknowledgement that some forces refuse to be paved over. The Tuatha De Danann didn't lose, they simply folded themselves into the land, waiting, because myths don't end, they retreat, and from the shadows they watch. Love and war aren't opposites in these myths, they're the same storm seen from different angles. Every story we've crossed, from Ares and Aphrodite's scandal to the Morrigan's bloody prophecies, pulses with a shared truth. Passion and destruction are twin flames. Look at Hathor, who could soothe a child with lullabies one moment and drown nations in blood the next. Or Inanna, shedding her divinity at each underworld gate only to return as something fiercer, hungrier. Even the gentlest myth, Psyche's trials, Midia's centuries-long search for attain, are scorched by sacrifice. These gods don't just fall in love, they raise cities for it. They don't merely wage war, they turn battlefields into theaters where mortal lives are just props in their eternal dramas. Yet the real revelation isn't the violence, it's the purpose behind it. The Aztec flower wars fed the sun itself. Indra's slaughter of Vritra unleashed life-giving rivers. The Tuatha De Danann faded into the land so mortals could inherit it. Destruction here isn't an end, it's the price of renewal, and love, it's never just romance. It's Freyja trading nights for a necklace that carries the weight of her grief. It's Tyr placing his hand in Fenrir's jaws to keep the world from unraveling. These myths don't separate love and war, they braid them together until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. So here's the question that haunts every story we've walked through. Are these tales mirrors or blueprints? Do they show us the chaos we fear or the power we secretly crave? When Ishtar demands worship through terror or Krishna bends morality to save the world, they're not just relics of ancient imagination. They're echoes of the choices we still face, how far we'd go for love, what we'd justify for victory, whether we'd rather burn the world or bow to its rules. The gods might be immortal, but their flaws are achingly human. Maybe that's why we keep telling their stories, not to worship them, but to understand ourselves. Now it's your turn. Dive into the comments and tear these myths apart. Do they glorify our worst impulses or warn against them? Is divine love just war by another name? And most chilling of all, if you held that kind of power, would you do any different?